Hello medicos, welcome to MED-JUNCTION. This is Nikish Kumar, MBBS student from Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Medical Sciences, Sevagram, Vardha. And today in the osteology section, we'll be learning about a very important bone of the upper limb, that is scapula, also called as the shoulder blade. Now, in this video, we'll deal with the general features of the scapula, attachment of various muscles and ligaments, the clinicals of the scapula, and also the arteries and the nerves related to the scapula. So let's begin. Now, talking about the introduction part, the scapula is a flat bone. Unlike the other bones of the upper limb, like the humerus, radius, ulna, these are long bones. But scapula is a flat bone. And what is its shape? Scapula is triangular in shape. So scapula is a flat triangular bone and it is located on the posterolateral aspect of the body. So scapula is a flat triangular shaped bone located on the posterolateral aspect of the body, and it is somewhat transparent. That is, it can allow the light to pass through it. So scapula is a flat triangular shaped transparent bone located on the posterolateral aspect of the body. It is also called as the shoulder blade, and scapula along with clavicle forms the pectoral girdle. Let us look at the general features. Scapula has got two surfaces. This surface, which is on the ventral side and facing towards the ribs, is called as the costal surface. The word costal comes from the ribs. So this surface that faces towards the ribs is called as the costal surface. And you can see here this costal surface is somewhat concave. So costal surface is concave and it has got a fossa. That fossa is called as the subscapular fossa. Now this surface which is behind is called as the dorsal surface. Now this dorsal surface, as you can see, it is somewhat convex. So dorsal surface is convex. But this dorsal surface is not continuous. This dorsal surface is divided by this structure. This structure is called as the spine of the scapula. So the spine of the scapula divides the dorsal surface into an upper part and a lower part. This upper part, which is present above the spine of the scapula, is called as the supraspinous fossa. Above the spine, supraspinous. So this part is called as the supraspinous fossa. While this part which is present below the spine, that is, it is called as the infraspinous fossa. So this is the supraspinous fossa and this is the infraspinous fossa. Now let us see about the angles. A scapula has got three angles: a superior angle, an inferior angle, and a lateral angle, also called as the glenoidal angle. Why? Because of the presence of the glenoidal cavity. So scapula has got three angles: superior angle, inferior angle, a lateral angle, which is also called as the glenoidal angle. Now let us move to the borders. Scapula has got three borders. This is the superior border. This is the medial border, also called as the vertebral border because it is towards the vertebral column. And here you can see this medial border is present between which two angles? The superior angle and the inferior angle. This is the lateral border, also called as the axillary border because it is present towards the axilla. And this lateral border is again between which two angles? The lateral angle, also called as the glenoidal angle, and the inferior angle. Also you can see this lateral border is the thickest among all the borders. So we have three borders: superior border, a medial border, also called as the vertebral border, and a lateral border, also called as the axillary border. Now let us move to the tubercles. This you can see is the glenoid cavity. Now there is a tubercle which is present above the glenoid cavity. Here you can see this is the tubercle which is present above the glenoid cavity. This tubercle which is present above the glenoid cavity is called as the supraglenoid tubercle. Also there is a tubercle present below the glenoidal cavity. This is the tubercle present below the glenoidal cavity. This is called as the infraglenoid tubercle. Now let us move to the processes. Scapula has got three processes: spinous process, acromion process, and a coracoid process. Three processes: spinous process, acromion process, and a coracoid process. Let us look at the spinous process. A spinous process has got a superior surface, an inferior surface, This is the root of the spine. We have the posterior border, which is also called as the crest of the spine, and the anterior border, as you know, this is fused with the body of the scapula. Now let us look at the processes. Scapula has got three processes. This you can see is the spinous process, which continues as the acromion process, and next we have the coracoid process. So there are three processes: spinous process, acromion process, and the coracoid process. Let us have a look at the spinous process. Spinous process has got a superior surface, an inferior surface. This is the root of the spine. This is the base, and this is the posterior border. Where is the anterior border? Like this is the body of the scapula, and this is the spinous process. So the anterior border is fused with the body of the scapula. So the anterior border is fused with the body of the scapula, and here this is the posterior border. Now the posterior border is also called as the crest of the spine, and it has an upper lip and a lower lip. This was all about the spinous process. Now the spinous process, it continues as the acromion process. This is the acromion process. Acromion process has two surfaces and two borders. This is the superior surface of the acromion process, and this is the inferior surface of the acromion process. This is the superior surface and this is the inferior surface. Also, acromion process has two borders. This border is towards the lateral side, so it is called as the lateral border. And this border is towards the medial side, so it is called as the medial border. So this is the superior surface, inferior surface, lateral border, medial border. Now this you can see is the upper lip. So the upper lip of the crest of the spine, it continues as the medial border of the acromion process, and the lower lip of the crest of the spine, it continues as the lateral border of the acromion process. Let us move to the third process. This is the coracoid process. This you can see is the coracoid process. Coracoid means like the beak. Now coracoid process is directed forward and laterally. Again, it has got a superior surface, an inferior surface. This is the lateral border and this is the medial border. So that's all about the process. Now let us look at the notches. Scapula has got two notches. This notch, here it is. This notch which you can see on the superior border is called as this notch on the superior border at the base of the coracoid process. This notch is called as the suprascapular notch. What do we call it? Suprascapular notch. Also, there is a notch here, this notch. What do we call it? This notch is present between the glenoidal cavity and the spinous process. So we call it the spinoglenoidal notch. Spinoglenoidal notch, because it is present between the spinous process and the glenoidal cavity. That's all about the general. Now let us look at the attachment of the muscles. So let's begin from the surfaces. This surface is the costal surface. It is facing ventrally and it has got a fossa. That fossa is called as the subscapular fossa. Now from the medial 2/3 of the subscapular fossa, there is the origin of a muscle. What do we call it? From the subscapular fossa, subscapularis muscle. So the subscapularis muscle, it takes its origin from the medial 2/3 of the subscapular fossa. Let us move to the dorsal surface. This dorsal surface was divided by the spine of the scapula into a supraspinous fossa and an infraspinous fossa. A muscle takes its origin from the medial 2/3 of the supraspinous fossa, from the medial 2/3 of the supraspinous fossa, as well as from the superior surface of the spine. What do we call it? From the supraspinous fossa, the muscle is supraspinatus muscle. Supraspinatus muscle. It's very simple. Now, also a muscle takes origin from the infraspinous fossa as well as the inferior surface of the spine. So what do we call it? From the infraspinous fossa, infraspinatus muscle. So from the subscapular fossa, from its medial two-third, we have the origin of the subscapularis muscle. From the supraspinous fossa, from its medial two-third, as well as the superior surface of the spine, we have the origin of the supraspinatus muscle. From the medial two-third of the infraspinous fossa, as well as the inferior surface of the spine, we have the origin of the infraspinatus muscle. The point is to be remembered here that from both the surfaces, that is the costal surface and the dorsal surface, there is the origin of the muscles, the subscapularis muscle, supraspinatus muscle and the infraspinatus muscle. Now let us move to the tubercles. What do we call this tubercle? This is the supraglenoid tubercle and this is the infraglenoid tubercle. From the supraglenoid tubercle, there is the origin of the long head of the biceps brachii, and from the infraglenoid tubercle, there is the origin of the long head of the triceps brachii. Now how do we remember it? Biceps, B comes alphabetically first, so it takes its origin from above. That is, from the supraglenoid tubercle, there is the origin of the long head of biceps. And triceps, it comes after B in the alphabet, that is T comes after B in the alphabet. So the long head of triceps, it takes its origin from the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. Now let us look at the borders. For the borders, we will remember a mnemonic, that is MILO, M-I-L-O. M stands for medial border. I stands for insertion. It means on the medial border there is insertion of muscles. L stands for lateral border, and on the lateral border there is the origin of the muscle, M-I-L-O. So medial, insertion, lateral, origin. So let us look at the medial border. This you can see is the medial border, and here we'll be having the insertion of muscles. Now this medial border has a costal aspect and a dorsal aspect. On the costal aspect of the medial border, from the superior angle to the inferior angle, there is the insertion of the 8 digitations of serratus anterior muscle. So on the costal aspect of medial border, we have the serratus anterior muscle. On the dorsal aspect of the medial border, this is the dorsal aspect of the medial border, there is insertion of 3 muscles from top to down: levator scapulae, rhomboid minor and rhomboid major. So on the medial border, at its dorsal aspect, from the superior angle to the root of the spine, this portion, we have the insertion of levator scapulae. On the medial border, at its dorsal aspect, adjacent to the root of the spine, here we have the insertion of rhomboid minor. On the medial border, at its dorsal aspect, from the root of the spine to the inferior angle, we have the insertion of rhomboid major. So that's all about the insertions on the medial border. Let us move to the lateral border. This is the lateral border, and again this is the costal surface of the lateral border, and this is the dorsal surface of the lateral border. There are no origin of muscles on the costal aspect of the lateral border. We have the origin of muscle from the dorsal aspect of the lateral border. From the upper two-third of the dorsal aspect of lateral border, we have the origin of a muscle which is called as the teres minor. So teres minor, it takes its origin from the upper two-third of the dorsal aspect of lateral border, and the origin of teres minor is in the form of 2 slips, one slip and the second slip, and between those 2 slips passes an artery which is called as the circumflex scapular artery. So between the 2 slips of teres minor muscle, there is an artery that is called as the circumflex scapular artery. Now from the lower 1/3 of the dorsal aspect of the lateral border, we have the origin of teres major muscles. So teres minor and teres major. That's all about the borders. Now let us move to the angles. This is the superior angle. This is the inferior angle. From the inferior angle, there is the origin of a muscle that is called as the latissimus dorsi. So the latissimus dorsi has many origins. One of its origin is from the inferior angle of the scapula. Also on the superior border, Adjacent to suprascapular notch, here we have the origin of the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle. Now let us take a look at the processes. This is the spinous process. This is the crest of the spine. This is the upper lip of the crest of the spine that continues as the medial border of the acromion process. So from the upper lip of the crest of the spine as well as the medial border of the acromion process, there is insertion of trapezius muscle. From the lower lip of the crest of the spine and the lateral border of the acromion process, there is origin of posterior fibers of deltoid muscle. Let us move to the coracoid process. This coracoid process has origin of two muscles and insertion of one muscle. The two muscles which have their origin from the coracoid process is short head of biceps brachii and coracobrachialis muscle. So both of them, the short head of biceps brachii and the coracobrachialis muscle, they have the origin from the tip of the coracoid process. The pectoralis minor is inserted on the medial border of the coracoid process. So there is origin of short head of biceps and the coracobrachialis, and there is insertion of pectoralis minor. That's all about the attachment of muscles. Let us quickly revise it. From the medial 2/3 of the subscapular fossa, we have the origin of subscapularis muscle. From the medial 2/3 of the supraspinous fossa as well as the superior surface of spine, we have the origin of supraspinatus muscle. From the medial 2/3 of the infraspinous fossa as well as the inferior surface of spine, we have the origin of infraspinatus muscle. Moving to the borders. The costal aspect of the medial border has the insertion of serratus anterior muscle. The dorsal aspect of medial border has insertion of three muscles: levator scapulae, rhomboid minor, rhomboid major. Lateral border, dorsal aspect, upper 2/3 part has the origin of teres minor in the form of two slips, and between those two slips passes the circumflex scapular artery. Lateral border, dorsal aspect, lower 1/3, there is origin of teres major muscle. From the supraglenoid tubercle comes the long head of biceps. From the infraglenoid tubercle, there is origin of long head of triceps. The latissimus dorsi, it takes its origin from the inferior angle. The inferior belly of omohyoid muscle takes its origin from the superior border adjacent to the suprascapular notch. From the upper lip of the crest of the spine as well as the medial border of the acromion process, there is insertion of trapezius muscle. From the lower lip of the crest of the spine and on the lateral border of the acromion process, there is origin of deltoid muscle. Coracoid process, tip, there is origin of two muscles, short head of biceps and coracobrachialis, and the pectoralis minor muscle is inserted on the medial border of the coracoid process.